Hi everyone, thanks for joining us at our home in our beginner urban garden. I'm Mary, this is Marcus, and we're excited to talk to you guys about the ways that we compost and use our compost in our garden, and tell you a little bit about the ways that we found good ways to compost, especially as we're generating awareness for International Composting Awareness Week and a campaign that we're doing with Fertile Ground to encourage and educate people on all the different ways that you can compost and use your compost.
My name's Marcus Long. I work for the Oklahoma Conservation Commission as an urban soil health specialist. And that's a lot of fancy words, but basically my job has two faces. I work with farmers and landowners to improve their soil health. And then I also work with non-agricultural communities to incorporate conservation principles. And I'm also a OCASA board member. I'm an urban farmer with NFS and Commonwealth, and I get to wear a lot of hats because this is the stuff that I love doing. So our compost is, it's not really overthought. It's kind of like more labor, less thinking. So we have 3 basic piles. We have one pile, and it's kind of our slow pile. We don't add any nitrogen to it. It's only things that are gonna break down slow get added to that pile. That way that stuff's out of the way and it makes our other piles easier to work with. So that pile gets things like sticks, very fibrous material from our garden, like asparagus stalks, for example, get added to that pile. And we'll add leaves. We have so many leaves at our neighborhood that we'll add leaves to pretty much both of our piles because we wouldn't have room for them all in one. So that pile gets some leaves, but it's mainly, like I said, mainly just carbon. And we really only harvest compost out of that pile, once a year, I would say. We get to harvest out of that pile as it breaks down. Then the middle pile, that's like our pile that we're continuously adding to. It gets leaves and kitchen scraps. It gets some of the more vegetative material from our garden, for example, like old tomatoes, really just leafy material, and kitchen scraps and leaves get added to that. And then the third pile, that's just our finished compost. That's stuff that we add to our garden. And then that middle pile, it breaks down fast enough. We'll sift that one out once a month, once every 2 months. We sift that one out pretty often. And and basically to keep that middle pile where we can sift it very frequently, we just turn it a lot. Every couple. I try to do it every couple weeks, but basically what I do is I just pull everything out. I put the coarsest material on the bottom. And then I pile everything back on, put some leaves on top. So there's nothing fancy going on. It's just, I know because we garden so much and grow so much vegetables, we kind of need we like to have a continuous source of compost. So that pile is just like directed at quick compost. I pull everything out and we spray it down with the hose. As we're putting it back in, we spray it down with inoculants, and as we're kind of piling it back into the bin, and then we're sifting at the same time. As we're turning it, we're also sifting it. So we get to kind of add a little bit to our pile of finished compost. Really about once a month. Okay, a misconception about compost that I want to debunk. As a urban soil health person, a lot of times farmers and their interaction with nutrients that can be very calculated. They're like, well, how much nitrogen is this going to give me? How much phosphorus is this going to give me? And that is good. Those are important things to know. But something important to know about compost is that you're getting a little bit more than just nitrogen. And if you were to look at the nitrogen percentages of compost, you'd probably see a relatively low number as compared to inorganic fertilizers. Those can be as high as 60% nitrogen or 40% nitrogen, whereas compost, even like the most nitrogen rich compost, probably not even going to crack 10%. So then you run into this like, okay, well, why should I use compost? It's more expensive for me to use compost instead of inorganic fertilizers. And kind of the reason being, and this is the crucial element that compost helps provide, and that I think people need to know, is that what you're adding with compost is carbon. And a lot of times people will say organic material. In gardening communities, organic material, people talk about it all the time. And I don't think the connection's always made that organic material is carbon. That's what we're talking about. It's just another way to say carbon in the soil. And what that carbon does in the soil, and this is a good thing to know too, it's not a composting myth, but maybe a myth, is that plants don't eat sunlight. When plants photosynthesize, they're using the power of the sun to capture carbon out of the atmosphere. They eat carbon. The same thing as we eat carbon, plants eat carbon, animals eat carbon, everything eats carbon. Plants just have a kind of a special way of doing it. And they take that carbon and they kind of have this trade with microbes in the soil, and they trade carbon, which plants are really, really good at capturing carbon. And microbes in the soil are not very good at capturing carbon, so they trade that carbon with those microbes for other nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, iron, you name it. That's how plants get their nutrients. So when we add additional carbon to the soil, we stimulate that economy. It's just a diuretic for the soil economy that's kind of happening below our feet, that kind of trading that's going on. It also can add microbes. In general, the soils that humans are interacting with tend to be highly bacterial. We kind of do things that break up fungal and larger microbes like amoebas and nematodes and things. We do things in human interactions with soil that eliminate fungus and nematodes and encourage bacterial proliferation. But when you add compost, you're kind of helping to rebuild that soil food web. You're stimulating the soil microbes with additional carbon. And so, yeah, that's the myth I want to debunk.
Hello everyone, I'm Mary Vixler, and I'm an OCASA board member, but for my day job, I work for the Oklahoma State Department of Health. I work in District 10, which is technically Cleveland County, which is more in Norman. So Marcus and I are beginner urban farmers, and we got to take a look at our bin method, and that works really well for us, like Marcus was talking about, because it's, we had low startup cost, and we like to work with things that are accessible, cheap to replace. We try to buy the least amount of new materials as possible, and that works really well for us because since we're a 2-person household and we eat a lot of our produce, we try not to generate too much food waste, but luckily when we do, we have a great way to compost. So we have found that the best method for us is storing all of our food waste and cardboard, paper, coffee grounds, tea bags, things like that we're just generating in our household. And we do cook a lot, eat a lot of fresh food, so we do get some of those, food scraps, food waste. We found the easiest way for us is to keep our scraps in the freezer because they don't go bad as quickly, don't smell. They do take up a lot of room, but that's the best way to store them until we can kind of once every few weeks when it's the winter and we're feeling a little bit more lazy, we'll take all of our scraps and take those to the middle bin like Marcus was kind of showing, and we work that in there so those can kind of start breaking down, and then eventually that will get sifted and make its way into our finished bin that we'll use in our garden. We use a little bit of our compost in our seed starting mix so that our seeds are getting some good nitrogen and minerals to get going. So I feel like like a lot of people, got really intimidated when I first started composting, and I was like, okay, this is a very scientific, technical process that I need to, get exactly right. And I think that based off of my experience, I want to help people kind of debunk that in their own heads, because yes, it is a very technical, scientific process, but it is also a process that nature's already facilitating and doing. So I like to kind of remind people, Marcus helps me remember this, that compost is already happening and we're just kind of trying to create an environment to facilitate it best. And I think that's really helpful because when you think about the environment, like that really has to do with your own situation of how you're composting, right? Like somebody who lives in an apartment and doesn't have, space for bins, like it's not going to make sense for them to try to replicate a bin method, maybe because they don't generate enough food waste to add as that green section into their compost, or they don't have enough way to get, those dead leaves or carbon-rich materials. So, your environment is really like your own situation, your own needs, where you live and what's going to be the easiest, most effective way to have a compost operation, and how much of the inputs you're generating, like your food waste or those carbon-rich materials. So when I started, I was living in an apartment and I was trying to get a bin method going, like just outside, that I was exposed to the elements and it was constantly getting wet, constantly getting, pests that I didn't want in there. And I finally kind of streamlined that to, okay, I'm in an apartment, a worm bin is like probably the best method for me that I can just keep in a closet. Just me, so that's a good amount of green waste to kind of generate. So I think it's really important to just go off of what your own needs are or your own environment, to find the best way to compost, because then you're setting yourself up for success and not, trying to replicate a system that probably isn't the best fit for you. So I think that really helps get out of the intimidation process, is kind of figuring out your needs and like what method is going to be the best for you, and that can look a lot of different ways. But the beautiful thing about compost is you don't just have to pick one method, right? You can like experiment a little bit, see if that's a worm bin works for you, but then maybe let's talk about a couple other ways, standing bins or even liquid composting if you have you're in a space where you need to utilize small ways of composting. But you can do multiple ways at one time. You don't have to just stick with one and be rigid around that. So I think that's helpful to kind of just treat it all as an experiment. And even if it's a failed experiment sometimes, where you have to scrap it and start over, like that's just adding to your future compost bin. So try not to take it too seriously, because it is meant to just be part of a lifestyle change and like figuring out a way that's sustainable for you to maintain. So you don't want to do something that's takes a lot of oversight if you don't have time for that. So really figuring out how to set yourself up for success, I think, is the best way to approach composting, because we need those wins.
Yeah.
It's really good.
You gotta be a nerd to get excited about this stuff. I just love it. Like, this just does it for me.